The metal cup trembled in Lee Sang-ho's weathered hands as he took his first sip of ice-cold Coca-Cola. The sweet, fizzy liquid hit his parched throat like liquid lightning, causing him to gasp and nearly drop the cup in surprise. Around him, fellow North Korean prisoners of war stared in bewilderment at the American guards distributing hamburgers wrapped in paper, French fries served in cardboard containers, and bottles of the strange dark beverage that sparkled like liquid amber in the harsh summer sun of the South Korean prison camp. It was August 1951, and for these men who had spent months believing they would die fighting American imperialists, this moment represented something far more shocking than military defeat. They were witnessing their first encounter with American abundance, a glimpse into a world so alien it might as well have been another planet. Lee, a former sergeant in the Korean People's Army who had expected torture or execution when captured near the Pusan perimeter, found himself sitting at a wooden table watching American soldiers casually distribute food that seemed impossibly rich and abundant while he and his fellow prisoners received meals that surpassed anything most North Korean civilians had seen in years. The cultural shock was so profound that some prisoners initially refused to eat, convinced the abundant food was either poisoned or part of some elaborate psychological warfare campaign. But this story isn't just about hamburgers and Coca-Cola. It's about a collision between two worlds, one driven by scarcity, sacrifice, and revolutionary purity, and the other by abundance, efficiency, and mass production. When North Korean prisoners of war encountered American prison camps during the Korean War, they weren't just experiencing captivity. They were getting their first taste of a consumer culture that would eventually reshape their understanding of what modern society could achieve. The year was 1950, and the Korean War was consuming the peninsula in a spiral of violence that would ultimately claim millions of lives. For North Korea, this was a sacred war of reunification, a struggle to liberate their southern brothers from American puppet masters and restore the dignity of the Korean people. The communist propaganda had taught soldiers like Lee that Americans were weak capitalist exploiters who would flee at the first sign of determined resistance, leaving behind their South Korean collaborators to face revolutionary justice. Meanwhile, across the Pacific, America was mobilizing its industrial might on a scale that would have seemed impossible just years earlier. The same factories that had produced consumer goods during peacetime were now churning out military supplies. But unlike previous conflicts, American forces were also deploying an entire infrastructure of abundance that extended even to prisoner of war facilities. The contrast couldn't have been starker. North Korean soldiers like Lee carried rice balls when they were lucky enough to have rations at all. Many subsisted on whatever they could forage from the countryside or capture from enemy supplies. Their equipment was often improvised, their supply lines stretched impossibly thin across mountainous terrain, and they fought with the ferocity of men who believed their very souls depended on victory. But they fought hungry, often sick, and increasingly desperate as the war dragged on and promised victories failed to materialize. American forces, by contrast, were backed by an industrial machine that could produce not just weapons and vehicles, but an endless stream of processed foods, bottled beverages, and manufactured goods. The same country that had perfected assembly line production and mass marketing was now applying those innovations to warfare on a global scale. When American soldiers went into battle, they carried rations that included chocolate bars, cigarettes, and instant coffee. When they established prison camps, they brought with them the entire apparatus of American consumer culture, including the fast food and soft drinks that would soon astonish their North Korean captives. The first major wave of North Korean prisoners began arriving in American custody following the successful Incheon landings in September 1950 and the subsequent UN advance toward the Chinese border. These were not broken, demoralized soldiers that American commanders might have expected, but rather elite troops, party members, and dedicated revolutionaries who had been at the forefront of North Korea's early victories. They had conquered Seoul, pushed UN forces to the Pusan perimeter, and fought with legendary determination against overwhelming odds. Now, suddenly, they found themselves prisoners in a land that seemed to operate by completely different rules. The shock began the moment they were processed into American custody. Lee later described his amazement at the medical treatment he received. The American doctors cleaned my wounds with supplies I had never seen before. They had bandages that came in sealed packages, medicines in glass bottles with printed labels, and instruments that gleamed like silver. In North Korea, even our military hospitals were running short of basic supplies. Here, they seemed to have an endless supply of everything. But it was the food that truly boggled their minds. American military doctrine during the Korean War emphasized keeping prisoners healthy and well-fed, partly for practical reasons. Sick prisoners required more resources, but also as part of a broader strategy to demonstrate American superiority and humanitarian values. The Geneva Conventions provided a baseline for prisoner treatment, but American camps often exceeded those requirements by substantial margins. The first meal many North Korean prisoners received in American custody was often their introduction to mass-produced American food. Hamburgers made from ground beef and served on soft white buns, French fries cut to uniform specifications and deep-fried in abundant cooking oil, and Coca-Cola served ice-cold in metal cups or glass bottles. For men accustomed to rice, vegetables, and occasional fish or meat, these foods represented not just abundance, but an entirely different approach to nutrition and pleasure. The hamburger, in particular, embodied everything that was foreign about American culture. Here was a food that had been engineered for efficiency and mass appeal. Ground meat formed into uniform patties, cooked on industrial grills, and assembled with processed cheese, lettuce, and condiments on buns that were softer and sweeter than any bread North Korean prisoners had ever tasted. The entire concept challenged their understanding of how food should be prepared and consumed. Lee's first encounter with a hamburger was a moment he would remember for the rest of his life. "They handed me this strange sandwich wrapped in paper," he later recalled. The bread was incredibly soft, almost like cake. Inside was meat, but not like any meat I had known. It was rich, salty, and mixed with things I couldn't identify. The first bite was overwhelming. There were so many flavors at once, and everything was so intense compared to the simple foods we knew in North Korea. The French fries were equally revelatory. Cut to precise uniform sizes and fried in oil until golden brown, they represented a level of food standardization that seemed almost magical to men who had grown up in a society where cooking was largely done by hand, and every meal was slightly different. The abundance of oil required to produce such foods was itself shocking. In North Korea, cooking oil was precious and used sparingly. But perhaps nothing symbolized the cultural divide more than Coca-Cola. By 1951, Coca-Cola had become so integral to American military culture that the company had established bottling operations near major bases and even in forward areas. The sweet carbonated drink was seen as a taste of home for American soldiers, a connection to civilian life and peacetime pleasures. For North Korean prisoners encountering it for the first time, it represented something almost incomprehensible. A beverage that served no nutritional purpose, provided no sustenance, yet was consumed purely for pleasure and was widely available even during wartime. Private Kim Jong-soo, captured during the fighting around Seoul, described his first encounter with Coca-Cola in vivid detail. "The American guard opened a bottle and handed it to me with a smile. The liquid was dark brown and bubbled like nothing I had ever seen. When I tasted it, the sweetness was so intense it almost hurt my teeth, and the bubbles made me cough. But there was something addictive about it. The more I drank, the more I wanted." Later I learned that this drink was available to ordinary American civilians, that children drank it regularly. The idea that a society could produce such things just for pleasure, not for survival, was difficult for my mind to accept. The cultural shock extended beyond individual foods to the entire system of food production and distribution that made such abundance possible. American prison camps received regular deliveries of fresh meat, dairy products, processed foods, and beverages in quantities that would have supplied entire North Korean villages for weeks. Industrial-sized cans of vegetables, blocks of cheese, and cases of soft drinks arrived on schedule, regardless of weather conditions or military operations in the surrounding area. The waste generated by this system was equally shocking to prisoners accustomed to a culture where every grain of rice was precious. American guards would discard half-eaten hamburgers, pour out unwanted Coca-Cola, and throw away food packaging without a second thought. For prisoners from a society where families saved and reused everything from string to scraps of paper, this apparent disregard for resources was almost incomprehensible. Some prisoners tried to collect and save items that Americans casually discarded. guards would often overlook such behavior, understanding that men from a culture of scarcity would naturally want to preserve anything that might have value. What the guards saw as harmless collecting, the prisoners saw as gathering precious resources that represented unimaginable wealth compared to their previous experiences. The hamburgers and Coca-Cola were more than just food and drink. They were symbols of an entire economic and social system that prioritized abundance over scarcity, pleasure over mere survival, and individual satisfaction over collective sacrifice. The same factories that could mass-produce hamburger patties could also manufacture weapons, vehicles, and equipment at rates that North Korea could never hope to match. The same distribution networks that delivered soft drinks to remote prison camps could supply ammunition to frontline troops and humanitarian aid to civilian populations. As weeks turned to months in American custody, many prisoners began to grapple with uncomfortable questions about the society they had been fighting against. If America could afford to feed enemy prisoners better than most North Korean civilians ate, what did that say about the relative strength of the two systems? If American guards could casually distribute luxury items like Coca-Cola during wartime, what did that reveal about American productive capacity and resource availability? Sergeant Park Min-ho, a former political instructor who had been responsible for maintaining ideological purity among his troops, found his worldview fundamentally challenged by daily exposure to American abundance. We had been taught that capitalist society was characterized by exploitation and inequality, that the masses suffered while a few capitalists lived in luxury, he later reflected. But here were ordinary American soldiers, not capitalists or officers, just working-class men like ourselves, who had access to foods and luxuries that would have been reserved for the highest party officials in North Korea. The social dynamics around food consumption were equally revealing. In North Korean society, food distribution was tightly controlled and reflected political hierarchy. Party members and military officers received better rations than ordinary soldiers or civilians. Food was often used as a tool of political control, with loyalty being rewarded through access to scarce resources. American prison camps operated according to different principles entirely. All prisoners received the same meals regardless of their former rank or political position. Former colonels ate the same hamburgers as former privates. Party members and ordinary soldiers stood in the same food lines and received identical portions. This egalitarian approach to basic necessities was revolutionary for men accustomed to societies where everything was rationed according to political status. The casual abundance of American food culture also revealed different attitudes toward pleasure and enjoyment. In North Korean society, pleasure was often viewed with suspicion as potentially counter-revolutionary. Food was fuel for work and struggle, not a source of enjoyment or social bonding. The idea that eating could be pleasurable in itself, that food could be consumed for taste rather than just nutrition, was foreign to men raised in a culture of revolutionary austerity. But watching American guards enjoy their meals, laughing while eating hamburgers, sharing Coca-Colas with friends, treating food consumption as a social activity rather than mere sustenance, gradually introduced prisoners to different ways of thinking about human needs and desires. Perhaps people didn't have to choose between survival and enjoyment. Perhaps a successful society could provide both necessity and pleasure to its members. The hamburgers served in American prison camps weren't just food. They were ambassadors for an entire way of life that prioritized efficiency, abundance, and individual satisfaction. The Coca-Cola wasn't just a beverage. It was proof that American society could afford to devote enormous resources to creating products whose only purpose was to provide pleasure and refreshment. By early 1952, many prisoners had developed genuine appreciation for American fast food, looking forward to hamburger days and savoring their weekly Coca-Cola rations. Some had learned enough English to request seconds or ask guards about the ingredients in their favorite dishes. Others attempted to understand the industrial processes that made such foods possible, asking detailed questions about American farming, manufacturing, and distribution systems. The cultural exchange worked both ways. American guards, many of them young men from rural backgrounds who had never traveled far from home, were equally fascinated by their North Korean prisoners. They began to understand that their enemies weren't the fanatical robots portrayed in wartime propaganda, but rather individuals with families, dreams, and human needs much like their own. Corporal James Mitchell from Iowa, who worked in the camp mess hall, later wrote about his experiences. At first we thought they were all brainwashed communists who would never appreciate anything American. But watching them taste hamburgers for the first time, seeing their faces light up when they drank Coca-Cola, you realize they were just people who had been fighting for what they believed was right, same as us. Food became a way for us to connect despite not speaking the same language. These personal connections, formed over shared meals and mutual curiosity about each other's cultures, began to break down the barriers of ideology and nationalism that had made the war seem like a conflict between incompatible worldviews. The simple act of sharing food, hamburgers prepared by American cooks and enjoyed by North Korean prisoners, demonstrated that human beings from radically different societies could find common ground in their most basic needs and pleasures. As 1952 progressed and reports of American bombing campaigns against North Korean cities began to filter into the prison camps, many prisoners began to understand the full implications of American industrial superiority. The same productive capacity that could manufacture hamburgers and Coca-Cola on an industrial scale could also produce bombers, missiles, and munitions in quantities that overwhelmed North Korean defenses. The abundance that prisoners witnessed daily in American prison camps wasn't just impressive, it was strategically decisive. A society that could afford to feed enemy prisoners better than its enemies could feed their own soldiers possessed advantages that went far beyond military technology or battlefield tactics. This was systemic superiority based on fundamental differences in economic organization and productive capacity. The hamburgers and Coca-Cola had become symbols of American soft power, demonstrating through daily experience that capitalist society could deliver material benefits that communist systems struggled to provide. The prisoners weren't being converted through propaganda or coercion, but through exposure to living standards that seemed impossible given their previous understanding of how societies functioned. As the war ground toward its eventual armistice in 1953, many prisoners faced the difficult prospect of repatriation to a homeland they now knew had been devastated by American bombing campaigns. They would be returning to a society struggling with basic survival, while carrying memories of abundance that would be difficult to explain to families who had endured years of wartime hardship. The repatriation process itself provided one final demonstration of American organizational efficiency and humanitarian concern. Prisoners were given final meals that included hamburgers and Coca-Cola, care packages for their journey home, and medical examinations that ensured they were healthy enough to travel. The same system that had fed them throughout their captivity continued to function smoothly even as the war officially ended. Lee Sang-ho stood at the rail of a repatriation ship in August 1953, holding an empty Coca-Cola bottle that he had saved as a memento of his unexpected encounter with American abundance. Around him, other former prisoners clutched similar souvenirs, hamburger wrappers, food packaging, photographs of prison camp mess halls, tangible proof of experiences that would be difficult to describe to people who had never witnessed such abundance. The North Korea they were returning to had been transformed by 3 years of devastating warfare. Cities lay in ruins, industrial facilities had been destroyed, and the population faced immediate challenges of reconstruction and survival that would make the abundance of American prison camps seem like memories from a dream. But Lee and his fellow former prisoners carried with them more than just memories and souvenirs. They carried a fundamentally different understanding of what modern industrial society could achieve when it prioritized abundance over scarcity, efficiency over ideology, and material prosperity over revolutionary purity. The hamburgers and Coca-Cola had been more than just food and drink. They had been lessons in the power of consumer capitalism to deliver tangible benefits to ordinary people. The story doesn't end with repatriation and reconstruction. In the decades that followed the Korean War, many former prisoners carried their memories of American abundance as they rebuilt their lives in a devastated homeland. Some became farmers who experimented with new agricultural techniques they had observed in prison camps. Others became factory workers who applied lessons about efficiency and quality control they had learned from watching American food production. A few former prisoners even attempted to recreate American dishes using available ingredients in North Korea, though such attempts were necessarily limited by resource constraints and political considerations. The memory of hamburgers and Coca-Cola became private treasures, shared only with trusted family members and close friends who could appreciate stories of abundance without viewing them as political threats. The American guards who had served in Korean War prison camps also carried lasting impressions of their experiences. Many returned to civilian life with enhanced appreciation for the abundance they had always taken for granted, having seen through their prisoners' eyes how remarkable American consumer culture appeared to people from societies based on scarcity and sacrifice. The hamburgers and Coca-Cola served in Korean War prison camps had demonstrated something profound about the relationship between economic systems and human satisfaction. They had shown that societies capable of producing abundance for their own citizens could also afford to be generous toward their enemies, and that such generosity could be more effective than coercion in demonstrating the superiority of their values and systems. But perhaps most importantly, these simple American foods had proven that human beings from radically different cultures could find common ground in their most basic needs and pleasures. The taste of a hamburger, the sweetness of Coca-Cola, and the satisfaction of a full stomach transcended political ideology and national identity, creating moments of shared humanity that no amount of propaganda could achieve. The metal cup no longer trembled in experienced hands. The strange fizzy drink had become a cherished memory, and the impossible abundance of American prison camps had opened minds to possibilities that would influence understanding for generations to come. The hamburgers and Coca-Cola had been more than just food and beverage. They had been ambassadors for a way of life that proved abundance and generosity could coexist, that strength could be expressed through sharing rather than hoarding, and that even enemies could be transformed into friends through the simple act of offering a meal and a cold drink on a hot summer day. Today, hamburgers and Coca-Cola are available in restaurants and stores throughout South Korea, symbols not of foreign occupation, but of prosperity and international connection. The North Korean prisoners who first encountered these foods in American prison camps lived to see their former enemy become their country's ally and partner in building one of the world's most prosperous societies. The war ended, the prison camps were closed, and the prisoners went home to rebuild their shattered homeland. But the lessons they had learned about abundance, generosity, and the power of consumer culture to create bridges between enemies would influence Korean society for decades to come. The hamburger had been eaten, the Coca-Cola had been consumed, but the ideas they represented, that societies could choose abundance over scarcity, pleasure over mere survival, and generosity over cruelty, would prove more durable than any ideology and more powerful than any weapon ever devised by human hands seeking to divide rather than unite the human family. That perhaps is the ultimate legacy of the hamburgers and Coca-Cola served in Korean War prison camps. They demonstrated that sometimes the most effective diplomacy happens not through formal negotiations or political agreements, but through the simple act of sharing a meal and recognizing the common humanity that exists even between the bitterest enemies. The food had been consumed, but its message would last forever.